Welcome to tonight's roundtable conversation on renaming and removal public memory in public spaces. My name is Miriam Gerber and I'm the research coordinator at the Center for Race and Culture. After the introductions of our participants, we will have a conversation of approximately 60 minutes with a 30-minute Q&A at the end. And so we would like to ask all of you to please post any questions that you may have during the presentation in the Q&A. We host these events in the spirit of engaging in a mutually respectful and considerate conversation on difficult topics. It is our intent to engage with our audience, and we encourage questions or comments. We have closed the chat box for the specific session to avoid distractions, but the Q&A will be open for our audience to participate. And we would be very grateful also to receive your feedback at the end of the session in a feedback form, which we will provide to you. Even though we are not gathered in the same physical space, we would like to acknowledge the land that CFRAC occupies on Treaty 6 territory, traditional homelands for many Indigenous peoples. With this acknowledgement, we pay our respects to the elders past and present who call this land home and remind all of us gathered here today of the responsibilities we have as treaty people to understand our shared colonial history and to work together towards a just future that includes and enriches all peoples. At the Center for Race and Culture, we are trying to go beyond a formal land acknowledgement and connect it to our current socio-political milieu in Canada and consider our parts as individuals responding to acts of discrimination and moving towards a more inclusive society. Many Indigenous peoples assert that increased protection and control of material and intangible cultural heritage is of special significance to them, and it is fundamental to the continuity, revival, and survival of their cultural identity in the face of past and ongoing forces of colonization. But as many of our institutions, such as museums and archives, are based on Eurocentric ideas of history, heritage, and art, the decolonization of these institutions is a slow and flawed process. For example, a curator of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia acknowledged that human remains of Indigenous peoples are still stored at the Laboratory of Archaeology, which has its own repatriation policy. The museum also holds items made from human bones, some of which are from Indigenous communities outside of North America. The Royal Alberta Museum still has a collection of 18,000 objects of Indigenous origin. These are only two small examples of the lasting impact of histories of violence and colonialism with respect to the perception and treatment of heritage, specifically the treatment of Indigenous human remains, which illustrate how heritage is claimed and appropriated, politicized, and subject to controversy. At the same time, heritage is something that concerns all of us and offers an opportunity to carefully listen to each other and to take steps toward acknowledging diverse histories, past injustices, and reconciliation. It is now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's moderators, Senator Paula Simons. Paula is an independent senator from Alberta and a former longtime columnist with the Edmonton Journal. She's also co-author of the popular history Alberta, 100 Years a Home, and a writer and producer of a number of CBC Ideas documentaries about prairie history. In 2008, she was honored by the Edmonton Historical Board for her writing on Edmonton history and her championship of Edmonton heritage architecture. Paula, it's my great pleasure to hand the moderation now over to you.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you to everybody who's joining us online this evening. It's my honor to be speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory, which is a fancy word for my bedroom here in Edmonton. But I am delighted to be here to moderate today's conversation and to introduce you to our amazing panelists tonight. So let me begin quickly because I think we have a really good conversation ahead of us. Let me introduce first Shannon Stunden-Bauer, who's an environmental historian, the former research director of the Parkland Institute, and an assistant professor in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta here in Edmonton. Her work focuses specifically on the Canadian Prairie West and is very much influenced by historical geography. Next, and I'm doing these in alphabetical order for the person who's doing the slides who suddenly panicked there. Next is Deborah Dobbins, who is the president and CEO of the Shiloh Center for Multicultural Roots. Deborah is a proud third-generation African-American Albertan, That means her parents were born and raised in Wildwood, Alberta, and her grandparents emigrated in the early 1900s from Oklahoma, Illinois, Missouri, and Texas. And we're very delighted to have Deborah with us this evening. Rob Houle is a researcher and Indigenous cultural liaison consultant. Rob comes from the Wapsisepi or Swan River First Nation in Treaty 8 territory in what we now call Alberta. And Rob recently served as the co-chair or circle keeper of the Innu Iskwawak Wihiwin. Sorry, I messed that up and I practiced so hard. The Ahinu Iskwawak Witawin circle, which was the committee of 17 women and Rob, lucky Rob, who worked diligently to give our city of Edmonton its 12 new different Indigenous names for our new city wards, each reflecting the diversity of Edmonton's Indigenous communities. And last but not least, Dan Rose is a born and raised Edmontonian and the chair of the Edmonton Historical Board and a member of Heritage Forward. He is also one of Twitter's most passionate heritage advocates and champions of architectural preservation. And I know Dan best from our mutual addiction to Twitter. And you could say he's passionate about connecting people to their local history and a great efficient at using social media to do so. So thank you very much to all of our guests. I wish we could be together. It is, I'm not going to lie, it is awkward to moderate a panel when I can't see you all at the same time. But we're going to jump in and we're going to start with our first question. And I'm going to throw this question to each of you in turn to start off our discussion. Many public buildings, institutions, and monuments in this country are named for people whom we viewed as heroes in the past, but whom we see as problematic, perhaps dishonorable, perhaps even wicked today. Is there any rubric or test we can apply to judge when someone's legacy is so tarnished, when their memory is so hurtful, that we need to take down their name from a building or a park or a school, that we need to take down their statue? Or is this always going to be something we have to figure out on a case-by-case basis? And perhaps in the spirit of reverse alphabetical order, Dan, I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. I'm excited about the conversation. With respect to the first question, I wish there was an easy answer for that. And in my role as the chair of the Edmonton Historical Board, we have a role in helping identify and determine what is historic and ascribing a certain level of value to places in our city that we feel have historic merit. And we do so through things like plaques and other recognitions and designating historic resources. It's tough to say. My initial thought is we're probably never going to have a good all-encompassing model or rubric of determining when a landmark has maybe outlived its relevance, or whether we're at a place where we need to reevaluate the role of a certain monument or a plaque or something of that nature. I think it probably is, by its very nature. I think the question is absolutely one rooted in the moment we're in. And I think when we first started naming things and putting up statues and designating historic buildings, we did so with a lens that was a product of its time. And it's tricky for us to always navigate those waters so simply and straightforwardly. But I think it's also worth noting that the monuments and statues and the names that we have around our city are fundamentally also products of their time. So I think it's absolutely worth having some sort of model or rubric to revisit them. I think having an answer sort of predetermined is probably tricky, but I think it's absolutely the product of conversations like this around things like statues and names that we've now come to learn are probably not the same, or don't have the same values that they did when we put them up in the first place. Is probably an important conversation. So no straight simple answer on that. I think we have a certain number of tools at our disposal, but I think really it is just about making sure there's room in the conversation around our public policies and our programs and practices that we've used to ascribe value and understanding to things like places and names and statues, and just being conscious that that's a a constant evolution. So yeah, tricky.
All right, so Rob, you've just been part of the procedure of renaming our wards, for which I think we had very little, deep affection. If I live in Ward 4 or Ward 12, I don't think I have a deep tie to that name. And that seems to be a renaming that I think people have embraced. But how do you think we should judge when the time is right or necessary to rename a public building or a park or a key landmark in our city?
Well, I think it's important for whenever you're trying to name something in general, the first kind of contemplation should be why. And if that why is because of these fantastic things that people did or didn't do through history and whatnot, there's always a story behind that why. And that's why in Indigenous communities, and at least in traditional Indigenous naming practices, we never really focused on naming things after people or individuals, because one of the first teachings you learn in kind of traditional kind of circles and just through history itself is that people are fallible and individuals are fallible, no matter who they are. So in order to avoid that, I think it's much more rich. It's more rich. It's much more rewarding when you start to explore other traditional naming practices, and which tell a much better story, a history, the actual activities of that name. And for Indigenous people, it tells of your journey through life and your experiences and things like that. And then if we're going to talk about removing names, then what is the benchmark? Where do we start from? And we have to remember that whether we want to admit it or not, in Canada, naming landmarks and the very erection of landmarks and things like that is very tied to conquest and things like that. So again, when you start to parallel these thoughts and these processes, and you start to equate statues and names and things like that to conquest, then and you can hopefully understand that through that conquest, something is being taken away. And it's usually, especially in North America and in Canada, the Indigenous people's histories, stories, experiences. So do we really want to continue to do that practice? Are there better ways that we can approach the situation? Do these people need a statue named after them? And then ultimately, hopefully after some, like Dan said, some fruitful conversation and thoughtful discussion, maybe an alternative kind of path can be brought forward. And if you were to ask some Indigenous people, maybe we start at anything named after 1492, definitely. Anything named after 1867, maybe we contemplate changing all of those names, because as I'm sure many people are aware, there's a movement in the United States and internationally now to remove a certain lost explorer, his name from certain days and certain experiences. Because again, when you start to understand the truth and the reality of his situation, what did he really achieve?
And Deborah, it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, Rob is saying that there's a deep tradition in his culture of not naming things after people. On the other hand, if we don't name things after all kinds of people, we tend to default to naming them after the same kind of person over and over and over again. And in Edmonton, that's mostly, white men. So what for you is the benchmark to decide that it is the right time to rename? Is it just because the person it's named after has that we now see them in a different and negative light? Or is it also because we want to make sure that we're more reflective of the full diversity of our community when we're naming things?
I think it is a time to rename something or someone when the name provokes doing wrong to a group of people, when it brings a negative feeling from a group of people because of their race or their culture or their ability or their sexual orientation or something, that a group of people are demeaned because of the presence of a certain name. I think that's the time now to change that name, because you don't want people seeing, anytime they see that name or hear that name, that it just invokes terrible inner feelings. That isn't fair to, if you want to be inclusive and make sure everyone feels welcome in this place, we need to have names reflective of positive things.
And Shannon, as an historian, and as an historian who studies the environment in which we live, at what point do we decide that a beloved park, which has taken on, where the name has taken on a resonance beyond who the person actually was? Maybe most people don't even know who the person actually was. I mean, at what point do we decide, okay, that name is so toxic, it has so much baggage, it's got to go, even if there are a whole other, dominoes of memories and emotions attached to that place?
I think we start by listening. I think listening to voices emerging from community, the sorts of communities that I hear Deborah and Rob referencing as they talk about groups that are harmed by the preservation of monuments to colonizer figures or racist figures. Those voices need to come to the fore, and we need to make space for those communities to lead. And I think that the wisdom in those voices will help us figure out when is the right time. And I would also like to note that renaming, at least as I see it, has the potential to be an opportunity, not sort of a burden or something inconvenient, but a chance for rich community conversation. And these rich community conversations can actually build more meaningful connections to history, to community, maybe connect people to parks in new ways, generate some of those valuable understandings of place and community. And ultimately, those conversations are so valuable, and they can build the capacity to undertake broader cultural change that goes beyond renaming, that maybe positions us to take aim at structures of inequality, racism, the legacy of colonization in any number of ways. So I think it's a moment of opportunity.
Here's one of the challenges that I face in my own mind. It is unfortunately the case that the same characteristics that often make someone a huge success in life can also make them a not very nice person. I think in my notes I wrote asshole, but I'm not sure I'm allowed to say asshole in this very august gathering. I think about people like Emily Murphy, who accomplished so much for the rights of women, admittedly for some women, for the rights of women who looked like Emily Murphy. But she was a racist, she was a classist, she was a bigot of the first water, but without her, there might not be women in the Senate. Frank Oliver, a terrible man in so many ways. I wrote an article once in which I listed all of the groups he was prejudiced against. And that's pretty much all of us here. I mean, Frank Oliver had a very narrow view of who he thought should be, his preferred Canadians. And yet, without Frank Oliver, the city we inhabit today wouldn't exist in the form that we have it, because he was a human bulldozer. So at a certain point, do we find ourselves unable to memorialize anyone who doesn't meet a 2021 standard of perfection? Should I direct all of these questions, or should you jump in at some point? I mean,
if I may, Paula, so your first example is a good one. And I've been sort of perusing archival images, and I stumbled on one a while ago, and it was actually an early iteration of the Edmonton Historical Board at the opening, the unveiling of Emily Murphy Park. And of course, there's the usual line of ladies in hats. And there's nice plaques on the little pavilion. And I had a chance to visit the park. It's a lovely little park down at the bottom of the hill by Horlock there. And you read the plaque, and there's a plaque from the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board, and there's another little plaque from the city. It says all sorts of lovely, nice, wonderful things about Emily Murphy. And yes, to your point, yes, Emily Murphy did a lot of wonderful, nice things. And we've come to learn over time that there's a few more chapters to that story that we've either neglected or we've just chosen consciously to ignore from the larger book of history. And I think it's to Shannon's point about opportunities for teachable moments. I think it's something like that where, perhaps that's where we take an opportunity to acknowledge that, yes, the people we've long held as the beacons of progress in our city are actually very fallible humans. And there's a lot more to the story there than we've probably come to learn in the very narrow view of history that we've taken on the subject. So, I think of something like that as a lovely opportunity to listen to those voices who are now coming forward and saying, we don't see ourselves in that narrative. We were on the other side of that narrative. And myth busting is very personal to a lot of people.
That's terrible.
Myth busting is very personal, regardless of which side of the myth you're on. So it's, I think we have an interesting conversation there to reinterpret and examine those plaques and those myths and really add some nuance. Like I would be all for adding a plaque beside the plaque that says, we need a plaque about the plaque to add some context and say, we've consciously omitted from the larger narrative of our city's history a significant portion of the population or significant voices in favor of a very specific moment in time. And I think we're certainly hearing those voices come forward now, and I think now is absolutely the time to maybe dovetail to your first question. I think now is the time because we're hearing it like we've never heard it before, and I think it's a lovely opportunity to have those difficult conversations.
So Deborah, do you think it is, are we always, what I worry about is that we're going to name things after people this year, and 35 years from now, people are going to look back and say, well, why did you name something after him, something after her? Are we setting too high a bar for the people we choose to memorialize, or do we have to accept that sometimes the same characteristics that make you memorable also make you problematic?
I think if we involve enough people, enough diversity in the decision of the name of the naming, I think then it will be less controversial in the future. It should be. And also about what Dan said about the plaques or the description of the and the reason why the person why the name is that name, particular name is chosen. If it's explained and you are educating those that are looking at it, and if you say the good, the bad, and the ugly about it, then no one, it's not hidden. I think a lot of times, for me anyway, like you say, Emily Murphy Park, I know that to me that's a negative name. That's what it connotates to me because I know how she was to my race, to my people. So when I see that, I don't really care for that park. That's what invokes in me. But if I went and read the plaque, there were a plaque and told about this person, all the good that she has done for the majority women in that time. But also she still had some struggles in order to be equitable and to be fair to others who are not of her in her comfort zone. I think that would give me more understanding, and it would be, we're all human, right? We all have our own little flaws and things, but it would justify the reason why that person was given that prestigious park. Emily was given that name on that park. So I think that's education, explaining and justifying and including as many viewpoints diversity and in before you actually name, it will decrease the confusion or the upsetness in the future.
So I want to put this question out then to both Shannon and Rob. Is there a danger, something I've wrestled with for a long time, that we whitewash our own history? I'm worried sometimes that if we knock down statues or rename buildings, that we're trying to soothe our own consciences by erasing the sins of the past and somehow not implicating ourselves in still being part of the colonial structures from which people benefit. Do you know what I mean? That we look and say, oh, well, I would never say those kinds of mean, awful things that Nellie McClung said. So we take her name off her schools or off her park. And then we go about our lives without making any internal interrogation of, what am I doing now in real time, apart from, slagging people of the past, to make sure that I am not complicit in the same mindset. So I'm supposed to be more articulate than this, which is why they asked me to moderate this panel. But do you know what I'm driving at? Sometimes I worry that it's too easy a solution to take off the name and not actually stop and talk about the colonial legacy of the person for whom it is named. That isn't even a question. Shannon, would you like to respond to what I blathered nonetheless?
Yeah, I appreciate that you're wrestling with something hard, as I think we all are. And if, we occasionally stumble through our words, I think that's because these are difficult things and they deserve our attention and our struggles. I suppose that in response to your comments, I think about separating commemoration from history, and particularly history education. Commemoration is celebratory. It isn't necessarily as tightly connected to evidence as historical understanding and historical education should be. Certainly, even in the case where statues of figures who we now recognize as problematic, to say the least, are removed, I will still be teaching about the role of these figures in historical processes. I might not be teaching about them in the same way, and I certainly won't be teaching about them in isolation, but they will very much remain part of our historical understanding. And part of historical understanding, at least as I understand it, is doing exactly the work that I think you're talking about in terms of wrestling with the connections between past inequality and present circumstances. I think that's a fundamentally historical question. Even in the absence of every statue out there, it would still be the work of historians and history students, and ideally all engaged citizens, to reckon with those connections.
And Rob, what do you think of that? Is you know what I mean? Like, it's easy to lop off Sir John A. Macdonald's head. It's a little less easy to erase 152 years of Canadian history.
Well, I think the key point, first of all, I would argue that our history is very whitewashed already, with all of the prominent figures, and I don't think the bar is very high. I think our bar is very low for people to be honored in Canada. I think,
as long as you're a white man, that is.
As long as you're white, as long as you're drunk, is one of the other kind of background parameters you have to meet, and as long as you had
That's
a
why
disdain,
nothing will ever be named after me. Yeah.
Right. So that, to my point, that bar is already set fairly low. But again, it's about re-examining, and again, to talk about erasure of history. The only people whose history that has been erased has been the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people, other people of color from all over North America and the Western Hemisphere, whether you be Indigenous, whether you be Black descendants from slaves taken from their home continent and countries and brought here and having their history erased. So it's important that we understand it in that context first, that although Canada does have 152 years of kind of pillaging resources in Canada, that there is an entire history that existed before that where women had the right to vote, where women were the decision makers in our communities, where fairness and equality and equity was part of the governance mechanism, something that we strive for in Canada now. So once we start to understand that and take a different perspective as to why we're honoring these people, I think it's all right if we start tearing down statues. But like Dan and others have alluded to, as long as we replace the statue with either a better understanding of history and the person's contributions and real activities and actions, and maybe even just leaving a pedestal blank with a plaque on there that tells a more truthful history, like they did with Duncan Campbell Scott and other people in Ottawa and area.
I mean, that would be a very powerful thing, to see the pedestal without the, because even the best of us probably don't deserve to be put on a pedestal.
Yep, exactly. And that's why when we start to talk about naming, maybe we should avoid naming them after people unless you do a thorough, fulsome background check and historical analysis on that person, much like they do in political circles and things like that. But even then, the things you do in the past sometimes matter and sometimes don't. And I think the main crux of everything is that a certain demographic within Canada and the United States has been favored with a very low threshold for wrongdoing or violations, and then it gets kind of forgotten about once they start to do good things. And it's not necessarily, history isn't necessarily a zero-sum equation.
So then let's talk about who gets to name things. I was really quite intrigued a couple of years ago when the Edmonton Public School Board adopted a very different process for naming new schools, where they opened the naming process up to the general public and people could nominate potential namesakes for schools. And they got some really interesting, diverse suggestions that I think they wouldn't have come up with just as their own committee. And I don't know how much that can be a model. Rob, I know we just put you on the spot to answer the last question, but I think I want you to start answering this one because of the work you and your committee did to find names for Edmonton's wards. I mean, how can we come up with actual processes for naming places, schools, parks, roads, subdivisions that is more inclusive of the whole community? Can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with the names for the 12 wards, for example?
Definitely. So once we were tasked with this impossible task of coming up with 12 ward names in 3 months, the immediate first step was to think about some sort of strategy and what were kind of the givens that we wanted to honor through this process. And of course, being in Treaty Number 6 territory, that was kind of the first decision was we have to honor the territory and we have to honor the languages that exist in this territory, because I come from Treaty Number 8 territory. I'm also a Cree speaker. I recognize that a lot of the work done in Edmonton has been very Cree-centric, but that's not the only language that exists in Treaty Number 6 and throughout this province. So it's important that we honored that. And then from there, what other kind of wrongs could we pay attention to? So again, looking at the Papa's Chase Reserve and some of the historical context there, and again, working with people from the communities and from descendants from the reserve and from the nation, and talking to them. And like we spoke about earlier, talking to those affected groups and wanting to hear their stories and their approach and what they desired, and how we could kind of try to solve some of those wrongs in a new way forward. And I commend the naming committee for wanting to do that differently. And I know in Edmonton, there's always been this kind of naming process established, and the naming committee has a role, developers have a role, the city council, of course, approves everything at the end of the day, but it's important that we start to look at different ways of doing things, maybe returning to traditional practices, and again, amplifying voices that haven't always been at the table or given a seat at the table, and then trying to work towards just a general consensus and a mutual understanding on what best would help educate everyone and help everyone understand Edmonton a little bit better, I think.
Deborah, I mean, there are so many. I mean, this city has been multicultural and diverse for more than 100 years. It's not like this is something that just happened over the last 20 years. So how do we make sure that the city reflects all of that history? I mean, we don't have very many things in this city named after our Black pioneers or our Chinese pioneers, or our Italian pioneers. I mean, the full diversity is not really on display, and I'm afraid our developers have a very bad habit of wanting to name everything, the Hamptons or Windermere. I mean, places that have no connection to Edmonton at all. So how would you like to see, I mean, groups like Shiloh be included in more of these naming debates and discussions?
Being at the table is a good start. When it comes to say a park is going to be named, there's a new park being developed and they need a name. Consider the people that would be using the park or the area where it is in. Again, like Rob said, go back to the indigenous times when that land, what was it used for? All of those things, we put those together and ensuring that the people that have been left out in the past are at the table to create new names, names that have never been used before. Like instead of the Hamptons, like you said, maybe, I have no idea, it could be Shiloh. Shiloh is a place called place of peace and renewal. I'm just using that as an example, not like we need a street named after Shiloh, but
maybe we do.
I've never really thought about that. But it is the first African American church noted as a Black church, for instance, in Western Canada was Shiloh. So sure, let's work toward something being named after Shiloh, but making sure that it is reflective, like that some of your part of your criteria when you are starting to name a park or a place or becoming a statue. So trying to just be more inclusive, and which can be difficult as to who do you reach out to, right? It depends on the existing, whoever's starting to name, to have that job of picking a name. So a lot of work to be done, but thinking outside the box, taking the indigenous ways of naming, getting the people together. I think that's a wonderful concept to start to do with the city.
And Dan, I mean, the Edmonton Historical Board doesn't name things per se, but you do have a lot of sway on what gets commemorated. I mean, you put plaques on things. Once you put a plaque on me. So is there something the Edmonton Historical Board can do or is doing to make sure that it is commemorating the full panoply of Edmonton's history and not just the dominant Anglo-Saxon narrative?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. We don't name things, but we certainly do put plaques on things. And our board is responsible as sort of the first gatekeeper of determining what buildings have sort of historic value and historic merit. So those are our mechanisms. To answer your question, I mean, we're actually doing some work with Rob, and Rob is right here on my screen. So hey, Rob, to do a bit of an audit of our website, which is our sort of public-facing. It's the website we use to tell Edmontonians, these are the buildings we've determined are the most historically significant buildings in your city, and you should know about them. And we realized a while ago that website was probably falling short, again, of sort of a few chapters of our history or representation of other voices than the usual. That we've sort of fallen into the habit and rhythm of celebrating and recognizing. But I'm really happy to hear comments from Deborah and Rob on this. And I think there's sort of two elements to it. One is I think there is sort of an opportunity in policy and programs to shift how we think about how we do our work as a board, and broadly how the city goes about things like naming and plaques. And part of it is opening up those processes to more voices and more diverse voices. I think of the composition of our historic resources review panel or a plaques committee, and with all due respect to the members of my board, but it's fairly pale, fairly stale. I think we could do a lot more to bring new voices and different voices into those mechanisms or into those conversations, and really open that conversation up to the larger community. We've started doing a little bit of work on this. I mean, we've had some really interesting conversations with the Chinese community around a plaque that will be going in the Chinatown area. But it's, we've not really taken bold steps, and that really brings me to the second point. And I think we really just need to be brave, and we need to be bold, and know that we don't have all the answers, and we have left a lot of people out of that. And I think we need to be comfortable with the idea that the narratives we've sort of long held, or the processes that we've long used to define historic value, are probably insufficient. And I think to Shannon's point earlier, it really starts with acknowledging that we've missed, and asking those voices to share their perspectives and their histories with us, and then listening to understand, not necessarily to respond, and then being comfortable with being profoundly uncomfortable with what we might hear about those stories. And in turn, I think the ability to have that conversation and creating room for those voices will hopefully lead to I think, a more inclusive narrative of our city's history, and the opportunity to really tell the full story of our city that goes beyond, the white guy with the handlebar mustache who probably has a school or a road or a building or something named after him. So there's certainly work we can do as a board. I think we're starting to take small steps. I think we're certainly very invested in taking larger steps, and the board was happy to support the work that Rob and the committee did to come up with new ward names. But until we see more work like that, I think we're in a bit of a pickle. So it's yeah.
Now, Shannon, your practice of history looks at the intersection of history, geography, the natural environment, the built environment. How important do you think it is that people have a sense that their own stories are being told in the bedrock of the place where they live, that when they walk down the street, they see themselves and their family stories reflected in the urban form around them?
That's an interesting question. I suppose I tend to think more of relationships, about how can places or spaces frame particular sorts of interactions between people in place and between different communities living in and sharing a space. I think representation is important. Having visible references to communities are important. Certainly eliminating harmful references that are very clearly explained as harmful, as re-traumatizing is a minimum standard. So I think it's significant. I also think that it's a step toward bigger processes. Renaming is important, representation is important, but ultimately, I think the goal needs to be dismantling structures of oppression. And renaming and representation may get us some of the way there, but it doesn't get us all the way there. And we need to sort of keep our eye on the prize to the bigger picture questions.
I would like the rest of you to respond to that. I mean, how do we create cities and communities? I guess I'm going to put this to Deborah and Rob. How do we create cities and communities where everyone feels welcome and included? I mean, it's not just a question of naming things, but how do we create cities for people where they feel themselves and their stories are embedded in the places, in the communities where they live?
I'll start. I know where our family lives, when we have the police come by our cul-de-sac and shine lights in our windows because we're the only Black family in the area,
Wow.
that doesn't make us feel very welcome. That has nothing to do with signs or renaming, but the police is just an example. Or when you're going into stores or in your neighborhood and you're walking and they cross the street, your neighbor, well, they're not your neighbors, but people in the neighborhood that don't live beside you and know you, they see you walking and they cross the street so they don't have to go past you. Yes, this is still happening here in Edmonton. You don't feel like you're welcome in your own home area. So those kind of things will make racialized people feel more welcome when you're just a neighbor, you're just a citizen, you're not singled out because of the color of your skin. And I'm just talking about my experience. I don't walk in anyone, I don't want to talk about walking in anyone else's shoes, but just my experience to make me feel welcome in my own neighborhood that I've lived here for almost 40 years. So that's still happening. So attitude change to make people feel welcome in their own neighborhood. And I don't have to live only where other Black people live. I should be able to live wherever I want to and feel welcome in whatever space that I live in. So it starts with authority and then a mindset on who we are as Albertans, as Edmontonians, and we should be accepting of each other.
And Rob, I mean, I think it's beautiful that we have named the wards as we have done. And I think it's going to be, some of the names are easier for non-Indigenous folks to wrap their tongues around than not. But I think with practice, I mean, we will all get there. And I think the names have a real beauty and majesty. But how do we go beyond making it just a symbol, like a land acknowledgement? At the beginning, Miriam Garber was talking about how do you make a land acknowledgement that it's not just a form of words. So how do we go beyond having the names to making sure that Indigenous Edmontonians feel really reflected and included in their own community?
Yeah, I think it's up to non-Indigenous Edmontonians and settler society and people like that to want to start to relinquish some of that power. And it speaks a little bit to what Deborah was talking about in challenging systemic racism and all these other things that we know happen in communities. But it's also about relinquishing some of that power and knowing when maybe not liking something is beginning to start to cross a line from just a distaste to more of a sinister kind of dislike and maybe racist or discriminatory in nature. And I draw comparison to a lot of the Indigenous words that people already say on the regular. People say Ottawa, Toronto, North Saskatchewan River, for instance. These are all Indigenous words that no one bats an eye when they're saying. They definitely don't get their feathers ruffled when they're saying them. So what is the difference there? The difference is that they've been used over time and probably placed there by a mistranslation from a non-Indigenous person that has just stood the test of time through power imbalances and things like that. But when Indigenous people want to exert some of that power and authority, are always met with discredit, with disdain, and it became even more paramount during this whole ward naming process when I mentioned earlier we were given an impossible task and we achieved that task to the distaste of certain people that are on our elected representation, and that to the point where they didn't feel comfortable supporting it, right? So again, how do we, and that speaks to just the power that people feel that they have the right to exert, and the imbalance of power. So how do we start to invite other people who we know are in the city and are making up large portions of the city? We start to invite them to tables, to conversations, to relinquish some of that power, to maybe start to reimagine our power structures and our governance structures, where instead of having, and usually the approach is, well, we'll have a representation from that community as part of this process, and sure, but maybe you can have a parallel process that with people from that community, not just one individual, that can be a much more meaningful relationship and education building opportunity than just one token seat for one person to diversify your board for things like that. So it takes a different way of doing things, a different approach, and maybe a loosening of some of the stereotypes and parameters that have been placed on some of these processes, where cost and things like that become an issue and a barrier, when really we spend money on more frivolous things, like a $1.5 billion pipeline they'll never get built.
We're going to think happy thoughts. So I'm going to move to some of the questions that are coming from the people who are participating. And I recognize a lot of your names. There are a lot of really engaged, thoughtful Edmontonians who've been working on these issues for a long time in our questions. Some of the questions, though, I think have been overtaken by our conversation. So this one, I think is a fresh thing we haven't talked about. Oh, where did the question go? It just disappeared from the bottom of my thing, but I remember basically what it was. And it was from, I'm sorry, your name has just disappeared from the thing. A local Edmonton filmmaker, popular historian, who's been working on the issue of statues in Edmonton that were put up by the Ukrainian community to celebrate figures who are really important to the Ukrainian nationalist narrative, figures who were also how shall I put this? Who were also complicit in Nazi war crimes, or allegedly complicit in Nazi war crimes, because there was that complicated time in Eastern European history when Ukrainian nationalists looked to the Nazis as liberators from Stalin, and then it turned out that they had made a very bad deal with Nazis who treated them as intermention, as less than human anyway. But we do have a statue in Edmonton that commemorates one of these figures who's really important to certain Ukrainian people, as an important, person who stood up against Stalinist tyranny, but whose statue is very hurtful to Edmonton's Jewish community. So the question is, how do we figure out, when there are communities who have different narratives, what statues go up and what come down? And I guess the other example I can think of to go with that is Mary Burley Park, which is a park in downtown Edmonton named after a very beloved figure in Edmonton's Black community. But the park sort of is part of Chinatown now, and the Chinese community, for I don't know that they're still involved in this, but they wanted the chance to turn the park into a Chinese garden and rename it. So what do we do when we have communities who each have their own legitimate narratives, and those narratives come into conflict? So maybe I'll throw that to Dan and Shannon to wrestle with for a minute.
It's a good question, and I think the first thing to remember is that I think statues, by their very nature, probably say more about the people who put the statue up than about the subject of the actual statue in the first place. They are inherently products of their time. And when I say their time, I mean the time of when the statues were erected. I think of another example as well, like the Trader statue that used to be in Centennial Plaza behind the EPL. I think we need to be able to have these difficult conversations, and there needs to be a safe space where people can really explore all the angles of it. I mean, I think when I think about history, I think if we're not arguing about it, or if someone isn't uncomfortable about something, then we're probably not doing it right. Because I think that is a pretty critical dimension of the entire practice of history. And maybe Shannon will have different thoughts on that, perhaps. But I think of I don't know if I would have a specific answer for the statue, the Ukrainian fella, but I think of the Trader statue, where you have a monument that has, in many ways, or did in many ways, re-traumatize, the indigenous communities that would have seen it, because it was just this absolutely laughable romanticization of this snapshot in time, where you have, of course, the guy with the handlebar mustache and the top hat, and then you have this image of an indigenous man in a cloth and sort of buckskin pants and not wearing a shirt, and you're like, this can't be right. Like this can't be an accurate representation in the slightest of what was going on in the Edmonton region. So it's, I think of a statue like that where it ultimately was removed, and I think a lot of folks were quite happy to see it removed, because it had the potential to traumatize and re-traumatize over and over. But then there's another side of that coin, where in the absence of having that very contentious symbol there, we do lose out on the opportunity to have that conversation, because we're not confronted by it. And I say that as the person who's probably not being traumatized by that monument, but it's an interesting conundrum, and I don't think we have a super solid answer for it, but I think we need to be comfortable with discomfort, and we need to acknowledge that our history has warts, and sometimes warts are benign and you can leave them there and it's a useful reminder, and sometimes warts are not benign and they need to be removed because they can be harmful, and that's, I think, a weird way to think about statues that make us uncomfortable, perhaps. But I don't know, I'll defer to Shannon for perhaps.
I'm starting to itch in various places, but so Shannon, how do we mediate when we have narratives that come into conflict, when a space is important to one community, or a monument is important to one community but may be hurtful to another, especially in a multicultural city like Edmonton, where you're going to have people who have complicated histories in their homelands?
Of course, absolutely. A difficult question. I suppose that in sort of my instinctive reaction, that is that in public spaces, safety needs to be prioritized. And so in a situation where a community wanted to celebrate and another community felt wounded or vulnerable because of the celebration, in a public space, my heart would land on the side of prioritizing the community's need for safety. But if I could maybe take it in a different direction, debates about statues, I think one of the reasons they're so fraught is because statues are invested with the notion of permanence. There's almost a fetishization of a statue, that this will stand here as a beacon for all time.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there isn't space to think more creatively about public commemoration. One of my colleagues, historian Ron Rudin, not at the University of Alberta, but a broader historian of Canada, recently proposed that in the Houle, where there used to be a statue to John A. Macdonald in Montreal, perhaps we could have an exhibition space where monuments would be erected for time-limited periods. I think sort of a changing of statues, rotating commemorations, might have an effect to generate more conversations, more engagement, more awareness of the past. And so I wonder if we couldn't maybe set ourselves up to engage with public commemoration in a different register if we remove the notion of permanence.
statues, I mean, the reason that we think of statues as permanent is they're big and heavy and really hard to make. And so, you know, they have a solidity and a lack of ephemera. They are non-ephemeral, I guess, which is, I suppose, why people feel that way. But you're right. I mean, it's, we do sort of treat them as totems after a while, where they become, and they take on a resonance from us that they didn't have. It's a bit like the Velveteen Rabbit. You know, you love it and it becomes real. So I am now getting a note from the organizers. I did something wrong. Before we went to the Q&A, I was supposed to do a 1-minute anonymous demographic poll. I don't know quite what that means. What does that mean, organizers? I'm supposed to ask you if we can do a 1-minute anonymous demographic poll for the people who are watching. But I don't know quite what that means.
Thanks so much, Paula. I will just launch the anonymous poll. We usually do it at the very beginning, but we just wanted to dive right into the discussion as soon as possible. It's just an anonymous poll. It would take a few seconds, hopefully just 20 to 30 seconds of the participants' time, but it will give us some database some data for our research towards improving our services to for Edmontonians of all different levels of the community. So thanks so much for providing this time for us.
I like your demographic thing, which is 40 to 60. So I still fit very comfortably in there, and I won't tell you which end I'm closer to.
That's awesome. Thank you. All right, we have a few seconds left, and then I'm going to end the poll. Thanks so much, everyone. I appreciate the time, especially to our panelists and Paula. Thank you.
All right, so shall we go back to the questions now?
I'm not sure if you want another person to chime in on that question.
All right, are we, I guess I was looking for a signal that we're, okay, but I'm just going to assume. So we're going to jump right back in. And I wanted to sort of see if we could drill down more into this question of contextualizing things rather than just renaming. A couple of people in the chat have made, a couple of separate people have made reference to a mural in Edmonton's Grandin LRT station. And I think you'll know what I mean. It was a mural that depicted gray nuns with little Indigenous children. And when it was painted in good faith as a depiction of gray nuns who came here to work as nurses. And as years went by, we looked at the mural again and went, wait a minute, are those nuns offering healthcare, or are those nuns taking Indigenous children off to residential school? And the mural became more and more controversial, but we didn't paint it over. Instead, artist Aaron Paquette, who I believe is lurking in the chat, he and his team painted, worked in collaboration with the original artist to paint a mural. I mean, he's an Indigenous artist working with Indigenous team to paint a mural that stands in conversation with the original mural. And I'm wondering what you think of that as a model for how we might, in public spaces, instead of just putting up a footnote plaque that says, oh, and by the way, this person also did this laundry list of bad things. Is there a way that we can learn from the experience of the Grandin LRT mural and use, you know, the problematic namesake to be a jumping off point for a different kind of piece of artistic expression or cultural engagement that goes beyond just sort of an editor's note explaining that person's fallibility. And maybe I'll start with Shannon for that question.
I think it's a good question. I think in the abstract, I like the idea of conversations between two depictions. I suppose I would feel, and talking in the abstract, not necessarily in relation to the Grandin LRT station example, but I would feel that there's a necessity to consider whether the conversation is sufficient to address the harmful power of the first depiction. I think it's at least conceivable that it wouldn't be in all cases. And to be clear again, I'm speaking in the abstract about that approach rather than in relation to a specific example. But I think it would be important to understand that might not be a suitable approach in all circumstances, because it might not be sufficient to remediate all harms.
And Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I think continuing on that point is that, the conversation is cropping up again, and I think one of the most important things about this journey that we're on together as kind of cohabitants of Turtle Island and these territories is that there are a lot of harms that were done. Then there's this process of reconciliation and consolation, and it's important that Indigenous people do not carry the burden of reconciliation, because we've already contributed in many instances our blood and sweat to the progress of this country. And I think in this instance, that's what people who were participating in it, like Aaron, have done, is they've participated in, done their part on reconciliation. And if the issue is still there and it's still visible and people are still being triggered by this piece of art, without having to add another plaque or anything like that, because again, when people are triggered, it's usually the image, it's an initial reaction and emotion that happens. You don't have time to gather yourself and go read a plaque and then expand on the story and things like that. So maybe in instances like that, when the artists themselves are ready to let the piece go, which I know artists are involved in their work, they place a piece of their spirit and soul into the work. When they are ready to make that sacrifice as well, and are content with just taking it down, then maybe you can remove it and add a different story there, and a bigger story about the journey that everyone was on. And then once the harm has been removed, maybe then you can add another plaque that says there used to be a piece of art here and now it's gone because of all of these things that happened, and then the Grey Nuns and Uville and everything like that. And Grandin as well, and some of the other people, Lacombe, played a role in my territory as well in Treaty Number 8 and some of the translations and mistranslations and negotiations and things like that. So again, it's not just a Edmonton story. A lot of these people have wide-reaching impacts on many, many people. So it's about having the conversation, coming to an understanding. And for me, if non-Indigenous people are at the place where they're ready to take action and meaningful action to help reconciliation move forward, then that's what this entire journey is about. And we should help them do that.
One of the questions from the Q&A, I don't know what is the matter with me. I keep seeing questions and then they disappear. But I swear this question was there. Somebody asked a question about whether they think it would be a good city policy to set sort of like diarizing, that every 25 or 30 or 50 years, you should just do an inventory of the names and see what is aged well and what is not aged well. I mean, do you think it would actually be useful to have a template that we convene a formal conversation on sort of regular intervals to check in with names and check in with communities? Or would that feel forced and artificial? What do you think, Deborah? Would it be a good thing if we if we made an appointment to have this kind of conversation every decade or every 25 years to see what names need to be refreshed?
If the conversation includes the people that possibly might be adversely affected by the names, that would be wonderful. Keeping track on the names, and you have to have a system, and it takes money of some sort. You can't have a volunteer organization do it, because I mean they'll do an excellent job, but it looks like then it's not a have to do job. If it has to come from the authority in order to keep it up, and it has to be like a paid position, or something that gives it value, because people see it. If it's mandated, then it's of value, and people will buy into it, and they'll have that serious conversation, and something will come out of it at the end of the conversation, that things will be removed or renamed. But if it's just an exercise just to be done, and nothing really happens, and it doesn't come from the government, who has the ability and authority to do something about it, then I think it's just an exercise just to be done.
And what do you think about, is it better, do you think, to bring people along gradually? I'm thinking about, we haven't talked about this, but it's the renaming of Edmonton's football team. And it seems to me that there was kind of a narrative arc that happened. When people first started talking about this 10 years ago, the general consensus was, well, it's an anachronistic name. It's maybe a little bit offensive, but nobody really seems to be that concerned about it. And there are not a lot of Inuits speaking out. So, let's keep the name because it means so much in Edmonton. I may have written a column like that a decade ago. But over time, I think the conversation changed. And I think that when Inuit leaders started speaking out themselves, maybe a new generation of Inuit leaders started speaking out, I think people here, when Natan Obed and Tanya Tagak started, putting this forward, I think the conversation here got more robust and mature. And when when the parallel conversation was happening with American sports teams, I really think there was an evolution in public thinking and public consensus. I don't know that we always have the time and the patience for that kind of evolution. But do you think there's something to be said for letting the consensus grow before you change the name? Or is it better to cut to the chase and not draw it out? Is it better to rip off the Band-Aid? I will ask that question of Dan and Rob.
I mean, I think this is a question that has stumped leaders of corporate offices forever. I mean, it's a question of change management is what we're talking about. Like it's how we introduce new ideas and challenge old assumptions. I don't think we've solved the question yet. I mean, they are now Edmonton Football Club or Edmonton Football Team. I think there is still a logo that looks a lot like the old logo. And I think there's been I would say, an unwilling or reluctant maybe acquiescence to the general consensus from the public. But I think if you sort of did a straw poll of folks on the street, I don't know if you would actually sort of find the answer you were looking for on the subject. But I think there's a push, there's a pull. I think you have to bring people along. I think just coming down and saying, we're rewriting history, like you're going to get an answer from folks. And it's a reaction we've seen all along. And it's a reaction that's taking place in Canadian cities and in American cities right now when the government or the prevailing authority says, we're going to remove this statue, we're going to change the name of this university program, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And people sort of naturally react not great to that sometimes. And I think there needs to be room for difficult conversations. I guess what I'm saying is the push may not work as well as the pull in this scenario. I think if you can't bring people along, and if people can't truly understand why things might have been wrong in the first place, then you probably haven't really moved the needle. I mean, if people just sort of say, okay, well, we'll rename the Edmonton Eskimos, and that's fine, I guess. But if they don't understand why the Edmonton Eskimos was an offensive name in the first place, have you really solved the problem? And that's, I guess, where I'm at, is I think people fundamentally, there needs to be room for understanding and reflection and growth. Otherwise, you haven't really solved the problem, I guess.
Yeah, because I think if people feel patronized and judged themselves, then you don't get to the reconciliation that you're looking for.
Yeah,
Rob, I'm curious about your own perspective on this, because I really do think the Edmonton Eskimos example is a good one of where there was a lot of community conversation, and I think the consensus changed over time. But can we always look to that as the reasonably happy outcome of these kinds of debates?
I think we're giving the football club and its leadership a lot of more credit than maybe they're due. And I would argue that it was very much a Band-Aid tearing off situation where years and years and years and whatever else of advocacy, of questioning, even from myself on Twitter and things like that, calling out the name, recognizing that it's been offensive for a long, long time. Even before that, I'll have to go back and look at when the dictionary made that word offensive in its print. But yeah, so I think it was very much ripping off the Band-Aid. Once money got involved, and once sponsors decided, and the clearest examples with the Washington football team as well, once sponsors said, you know what, we don't want to be associated with any kind of hurtful names, that's when all of a sudden the board and leadership decided, well, I guess we better change the name now, right? And that was very much a knee-jerk reaction to a long-standing conversation that has been happening with just one side of the table. And I would argue that the football team wasn't doing a very good job of educating their fans about what the real issues were, because they did their whole northern tour, and they did their whole going to schools in the north to teach people football skills and whatever else they were doing. And they invited Indigenous chiefs, First Nations chiefs, to come to football games. Well, even the layman should know that First Nations chiefs are not Inuit, and we definitely don't speak on behalf of Inuit peoples. So again, it was a lot of window dressing and a lot of political maneuvering to try to avoid having this eventual change. And it was eventually going to happen. It was just a matter of how willing people would be to affect that change. And I, for one, never envisioned in my lifetime, at least, seeing how slow people are to want to change and to release some of these colonial grasps that they have of the Washington team changing the name, or the Cleveland baseball team changing the name. But here we are, in the matter of, I would give or take 2 years, these things are happening. And for Indigenous people, we don't have to seek caricatures of ourselves, and we don't. They'll probably still do it, but we don't have to be victimized by the tomahawk chop and things like that when we watch a baseball game or go to a baseball game. So it's going to be really interesting. And I made the statement online that once they change the name, I'll be one of the first people to buy a new jersey, because then I can wear it with some sort of pride or connection to the team that is no longer using derogatory terms and things like that as a name. And I think that's something that was lost throughout this conversation, is that sure, your fan base, they've been with you for years and whatever else, but there is an entire other fan base out there that you haven't even tapped into, because they can't get over the fact that their name's racist. So I think it'll be on the bottom line, they'll be happily surprised once the new equipment and once the new jerseys and everything start flowing, and they see people wearing it with pride, as opposed to maybe a little bit of shame that they had before.
It's funny though, Robbie. I mean, what you're talking about is, in some ways, capitalism, which gets a rather bad name, at work, right? You know, it's when the advertisers and the corporate sponsors pick up what's happening in the zeitgeist. And when somebody realizes, hey, we can sell a lot of jerseys and sweatshirts and hats, yeah, economics are a powerful motivator. So I have a question on our chat board from Corey Souza, who I know, I don't know if Corey is still with the city's naming branch, but I know that's when I was a journalist, I spoke to him a couple of times about naming things. And so he asks this question: what is a name or type of name that doesn't bring any negative feelings or emotions? For example, he writes, I thought names of birds would be safe, but then we discovered a cultural group viewed the name Raven as negative, and therefore the developer asked the city to change the road name so the developer could sell their lots associated with that name. Therefore, is there a name that produces zero negativity? And I suppose I would add to that, and if the name produces zero negativity, is it an interesting name? So what do you think, Shannon? Are there names, like, are there perfectly neutral names that everybody likes, or are you always going to run a risk that somebody is not going to like a name for some reason that you might not even be able to predict?
Well, we might be getting beyond my expertise if we're asking me to sort of identify names without harm. But I think we need to be careful not to argue the point to the ridiculous. I mean, not all harms are equal. Not all harms are massive harms related to the operation of colonialism, related to the ongoing operation of white supremacy. We should be able to, in a considered way, adjudicate between what is an interesting and provocative and suggestive name and what is a name that does real damage through traumatizing and re-traumatizing communities that are already subject to ongoing structures of oppression.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, it is a challenge, and I know that Corey will know this. There have been times when the city has come up with what I thought were quite beautiful poetic names for subdivisions based on indigenous flora and fauna. I don't mean indigenous in the sense of Aboriginal. I mean indigenous in the sense of, like, you know, local trees. And the developers pushed back against those names and wanted really boring sort of traditional suburban names because they thought that people wouldn't want to live in neighborhoods named after our beautiful uh, natural you know, native species. So I mean, I don't know to what extent that is an accurate assessment of the housing you know, house buying demographic, or whether we default to the same kinds of names. And I wrote a column at the time making fun of the fact that they, you know, I think we already had a River Bend and a River View, and they wanted to call it River something else. And I said, you know, like, even like, pity the ambulance dispatcher who's trying to figure out where to send people in Edmonton if all the names sound alike, or all the names sound like, you know, what do they say about Donald Trump, that he was a poor person's idea of a rich person? That I think sometimes our developers pick these names that are supposed to be evocative of fancy places in England or the American Eastern Seaboard, without thinking whether those names have any place or any connection to here. I mean, to what extent, I don't know, maybe this is a question for Dan. To what extent should the city just put its foot down and say, no, you can't name another place Riverview, Rivercrest, Riverside, find a different name?
I'm glad Corey has posed the question. I'm sure he was listening to a lot of this with great agony at some points. I think it's an impossible question to answer. I mean, on the one hand, there is no, I think, subject matter that we could determine that at some point it would not be identified by someone somewhere as having some level of harm or offense, to Shannon's point. But that said, you know, I think names are incredibly important, and they ascribe value, and they create identity and meaning. And in a lot of ways, people use names to really create a connection to where they are or who they are. And I think that exercise that Rob and the committee has gone through to come up with relevant, meaningful Indigenous names tied to place and the cultures that have been in the place that we now live in. I think that's an exercise where we can really take a step back and bring in voices who have been on the margins and try and practice history from the margins for the margins, as opposed to the sort of way we've gone about it for, I would say, the predominant time that I've been around doing this kind of thing. And to be clear, the city has naming policies. I'm not familiar with them, but I know the naming committee would be. And I think there's a few of those folks listening, and whether it's a matter of taking steps to shake that policy or get rid of the policy altogether and come up with, as Rob alluded to earlier, an entirely different process or a parallel process to find ways to create connection and describe value and meaning to the places we share. I don't know if there's a great answer for it, but I think there's certainly opportunities to have more inclusive conversations around names, and maybe that's the starting point, is just acknowledging that the structures we've used in the past have fallen far short of helping people feel represented or a part of their community. I think of all those new suburban names, and to your point, yeah, they're like, I don't know anything. I don't want to live in the Hamptons. Like, what does that have to do with anything here? And I think of an exercise in Blatchford, for example, and granted, it's inspired by a moment in time, but it's really interesting to see communities and streets and things in the Blatchford community that are echoing the past with a relevant connection to that history of the Blatchford airport on the north side of town. So, I think there's a lot to it. I don't think we can answer Corey's question. It's an impossible question for sure, but it's a good question to initiate conversation about the structures we use to name things.
All right, I have a question from Stephen Sander, who says, let's face it, one of the reasons we have statues is to draw visitors to our cities. When we talk about cultural clashes in our naming, should we only think of them in Edmonton terms, or should we think about those who visit our city? I'm thinking about, I don't know, we just unveiled a statue to Bob and Doug. I know that there are people in Edmonton who want a statue of Wolverine because Wolverine is from Edmonton. At least in the Marvel canon. So, I mean, should we be thinking about ourselves, or should we be actually, trying to come up with things that market the city outside? I don't know, Rob and Deborah, do you want to have a crack at that?
Sure, Paula, and I'll just touch on the previous kind of discussion topic as well. So it speaks to what Corey was alluding to. Maybe they need to speak to more people, because in Indigenous culture, the raven is not a negative kind of being. It's a trickster, and as well, he plays a very, very important role in some of our creation stories. He's the one who returned the sun to where it should be, and that's how he turned black. So once you start to understand that history a little bit more, maybe it changes the conversation and gets a better depiction of what the names could be. And I think Raven would be a fantastic name given that context and that history and that understanding. But back to whether or not we need to look at our time or look beyond our time, I think the problem with a lot of the naming initiatives is that they're very much frozen in time, and they come from a time where people were successful and people were only focused on kind of their achievements and not necessarily the broader picture. And I think it's important that we start to consider, what would this name look like in the years to come? Is it worth all the time and effort to start to place some of this homage on them? And maybe we start to look at fictional characters like Wolverine, who is from Edmonton and also from kind of the Fort McMurray area as well. He's also rumored to be part Indigenous, right? So again, it's a very fantastic story, but then you'd have people analyzing the comic books and then probably pulling up negative things from there as well. So maybe it warrants a fulsome thought about just naming in general and a consideration of how we've been naming, because we haven't been doing a fantastic job of it.
All right, Deborah, I'm going to give the last word to you because I'm getting the wrap up signal, and it is now 8:31 on my clock. Oh, sorry, 6:31. My clock thinks it's in Ottawa. It is 6:31. Not to frighten people. So Deborah, I mean, what do you think when we're designing our city, when we're putting up our memorials and our statues and our names? Should we be thinking about how this looks to others from outside the city? Should we be thinking about how we market the image of our city, or should we be making those choices for ourselves?
I think we need to go to our citizens and what do we value as Edmontonians? What are we proud of, and what do we want to share with others who come to visit? And then create the statues or the artwork or whatever it is that that makes us Edmonton. So we should see a variety of diversity in what we share with visitors to Edmonton.
And really big baseball bats. I want to thank everybody who's been a part of this really important, timely discussion. I want to thank all of the people who were posting questions and comments in the chat, in the Q&A section. Not all of you were posing questions. Some of you were, making really interesting comments, and I don't know if there's a way that people can see that after the fact, but if you haven't had a chance to look at the Q&A, it is a really interesting side conversation happening there. I want to thank Rob and Dan and Deborah and Shannon for lending their voices and their expertise and their passion to this debate. I want to thank Miriam and Stephanie and Myrna and everybody whose names I can't see on the screen to remind me who all was a part of this, but I know that many different organizations came together to make this evening happen. And I would just like to say, on this day when I think, like a lot of Canadians, I was looking across the border to see the change of government in the United States and reflecting on what the last 4 years in North American politics have been. I am really proud to have been part of this discussion, which was always thoughtful and a model of civility and dealt with really difficult, complicated, painful subject matter, and did it with, I think, real respect from all of the people who were the panelists. And I'm really proud to be from a city that can have an event like this. And I'm really happy that I could be a small part of it. So Miriam, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Yes, thank you so much, Paula. Those were beautiful closing comments. We are now, unfortunately, at the end of our conversation today. It was a really amazing, very intense conversation. And we would like to thank, of course, all our panelists and Paula Simon to be here with us tonight. We would also like to thank the Edmonton Historical Board for their interest in the initiative, and for our audience, of course, for joining us tonight. We would like to invite you to please share any feedback that you have on our feedback form. I believe the link to the document has been posted in the chat. It's really important to us to hear back from our participants and the audience in terms of planning for future events, or also if you have any suggestions or an interest in collaborating, we would also really like to hear from you. So thank you all so much for taking the time to be here tonight. Everyone have a lovely rest of the evening, and stay safe and stay healthy. Good night.
Thank you.